In about a month from now, we should see a ton of player movement as NFL free agency is finally among us. And about a year ago, we made one of our most successful videos to date when we ranked 6 NFL stars who are going to be leaving their original team via free agency. And for the most part, we hit on a decent amount of them, even predicting Tom Brady to Tampa Bay at the very beginning of the offseason. So we're attempting to do the very same thing here today, bringing you guys 9 NFL players that are guaranteed to leave their NFL team in free agency and why they would plan to do so. Before we get to the content, I just want to let you guys know we're giving away a PlayStation 5 to a subscriber that turns on our notifications on this channel. Whether you're an old subscriber or a new subscriber, if you sub and hit that notification bell, you have entered for a chance to win a PlayStation 5. If you want additional entries, then make sure you're followed on Instagram and Twitter, because I use Instagram and Twitter to feature your takes on our content. Now that we got all that out of the way, break! Mike check 1212. The very first player that makes an appearance on this list is also a player that was featured on our list last year, but ultimately would end up getting franchise tagged, and to this day, I still think that didn't make very much sense. And that's Adriel Jeremiah Green, aka AJ Green. Now, up until 2017, AJ Green was considered to be a consistent Pro Bowl wide receiver that would terrify opposing defenses despite having Andy Dalton as his quarterback. As a matter of fact, during the first 7 years of his career, AJ Green has eclipsed the 1,000-yard receiving mark in 6 of those 7 seasons. The one season he didn't, he was just 36 yards short, and that was because he played 6 less games. But an injury towards the 2018 NFL season seemed to have changed things for AJ Green, and he hasn't been the same player since. But regardless, even though he was hampered by an injury, last year the Cincinnati Bengals made a very interesting decision. Despite drafting T. Higgins and having John Ross, Tyler Boyd, and Auden Tate on the roster, the Cincinnati Bengals decided to franchise tag AJ Green, which, in my opinion, was a huge overpay. But I understand the logic here. You just drafted Joe Burrow with the #1 overall pick. You want to make sure that he has as many good targets as possible to throw it to. If AJ Green and Joe Burrow have good chemistry, then it may make sense to bring AJ Green back in the long term. Well, it appears as though AJ Green and the Cincinnati Bengals are just due for a divorce at this point. You could tell in his body language during the season, and I was surprised he wasn't traded at the trade deadline. This year, AJ Green had 523 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, and only 47 receptions, despite being targeted 104 times. For comparison, in 2016, AJ Green was also targeted 100 times, came up with 66 receptions and 964 yards. He might not be the player he once was, but I believe he could provide a good presence in a locker room of a team that is trying to make a push in the playoffs. AJ Green has experienced a lot of individual success, but not so much a lot of team success, so I expect him to be making a push for that. I'm expecting a Andre Johnson-like fall off on the next team that he is on, but I hope I am incorrect. Up next, we have JaMarvin Clowney, and this is a player that has been chasing the bag for the past 2 years. JaMarvin Clowney is a good player, but in my opinion, he's not a great player. He is the #1 overall pick in the 2014 NFL draft, which means he is the top pass rusher taken in that draft. But this is also a draft that featured Khalil Mack and Aaron Donald. And when you're going to be compared to those 2 players, you better be able to put up a decent amount of sacks, especially if those 2 players were picked after you. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case for JaMarvin Clowney. He's still a remarkable run stopper. He has plenty of tackles for a loss, but he's not on the Khalil Mack tier or the Aaron Donald tier of edge rushers, and I wouldn't even categorize him as an edge rusher. Regardless, depending on whatever team offers him the most money, expect JaMarvin Clowney to go there. I would hope that he would remain in Tennessee so he could at least have some stability for the first time in his career. Maybe a 1-year prove-it deal with Tennessee is just what what the doctor ordered for JaMarvin Clowney, because in 8 games with the Tennessee Titans, all he has to show for it is 1 forced fumble, 4 passes defended, 4 tackles for a loss, and 14 solo tackles. He has 6 QB hits to his name as well, but he didn't even notch a single sack this year. But knowing JaMarvin Clowney, he is going to be leaving to the highest bidder, and ever since leaving Houston, his overall value as a player has began to plummet. And speaking of another pass rusher that had a similar fate to JaMarvin Clowney, let's talk about Yannick Ngakoue. If there's been one player that has shown me that he could consistently get to the quarterback, it's Yannick Ngakoue, who has averaged 8 sacks 3 times in his career, including his rookie season in the past 2 years. But what was impressive about this year is he got traded to 2 different teams at a specific point through no fault of his own. The Jacksonville Jaguars didn't want to pay him, and he kind of had a falling out with them, even going after their owner's son on Twitter. And when he got traded to Minnesota, he was good, but the Minnesota Vikings weren't anywhere near contention, so they traded him to the Baltimore Ravens. At this point, Yannick Ngakoue has one problem. He needs to get paid for his production. And while I do think the Baltimore Ravens would be interested in bringing him back, I feel like the Ravens are more focused on signing Lamar Jackson to a long-term deal this offseason than focused on potentially extending Yannick Ngakoue, who they had a small sample size of, although he was very impressive in that small sample size. Pass rushing will always be at a premium in the NFL, so I'm sure some team will overpay for Yannick Ngakoue's services this upcoming season, or for the Baltimore Ravens to even potentially hit him with the franchise tag. He fits into any team that is employing a 4-3 defense. Now, up next, we have Patrick Peterson, a player that up until 2018 was a consistent Pro Bowler. However, ever since the Arizona Cardinals switched to Vance Joseph as the defensive coordinator, Patrick Peterson's production has fallen off of a cliff, so much so that both him and the Arizona Cardinals decided that it was in their best interest to move on from each other, which is fine because I think there's plenty of teams in the NFL that could use Patrick Peterson's services. I personally can imagine him signing with the Kansas City Chiefs to reunite with Tyrann Mathieu because they have a friendship going all the way back to their time at LSU with one another, and Tyrann Mathieu also credits Patrick Peterson for helping him get his life in order towards the beginning of his career when they were teammates on the Arizona Cardinals, which Patrick Peterson pushed the Cardinals to draft Tyrann Mathieu in the later part of the NFL draft. There's a chance that Patrick Peterson isn't the player that he once was, or there's a chance that the reason why his production isn't nearly as good is because of Vance Joseph being implemented at the defensive coordinator position. And I'm sure some team wouldn't mind paying him to find out. What about the other side of the ball? Are there any other wideouts aside from AJ Green that would like to move on from their team? Well, it's a known fact that Kenny Golladay is over his partnership with the Detroit Lions. If you were watching Lions games earlier this year, you'd see that the Detroit Lions were featuring Kenny Golladay a little bit less in their offense towards the latter part of the season. Golladay is without a doubt the most promising wide receiver on the Detroit Lions, and was even a Pro Bowler during the 2019 NFL season after his second consecutive year of over 1,000 yards receiving and recording 11 touchdowns. Any team that is in desperate need of wide receiver help would love to have Kenny Golladay on their roster, and maybe he might find his way to Los Angeles to reunite with the same quarterback that he's had throughout his entire career, and that's Matthew Stafford. Although it could be a little bit of a long shot because the LA Rams don't necessarily have a lot of salary cap flexibility. On top of that, the Rams like going for bigger wide receivers that also can be used in the run game as run blockers that have a good amount of speed to them. Another wide receiver that is guaranteed to leave his team this year is Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson thought he was coming into a good situation in Chicago. They just got the offensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs and Matt Nagy. They were aggressive in drafting their quarterback of the future in Mitchell Trubisky. They even went out and traded multiple first-round draft picks for Khalil Mack. And ultimately, unfortunately for Allen Robinson, the Chicago Bears weren't able to materialize. The closest they've come to any playoff success was ruined by a Cody Parkey shanked field goal. And Allen Robinson has hinted multiple times that he wants to sign with a contender because he really wants to win a Super Bowl ring. I wouldn't be surprised if he made his way onto the Green Bay Packers. It'd be interesting to see if he'd be willing to take a pay cut in order to join a contender, despite being just 27 years old. Our final wide receiver on this list has to be JuJu SmithSchuster, and whenever he was given the opportunity to hint at the fact that he is probably leaving the Pittsburgh Steelers, JuJu had made it really, well, kind of clear that he's ready to move on. The Pittsburgh Steelers have invested heavy draft capital in drafting wide receivers over the past 4 years, including JuJu SmithSchuster in 2017, Deontay Johnson, James Washington, and more recently, Chase Claypool. All of those players were second-round draft picks, and with the amount of money that JuJu will be commanding, which he said is about $15 million to $17 million a year, then I can't imagine the Steelers thinking that they need to bring back JuJu SmithSchuster in order to be a contender this year. On top of that, I feel like JuJu is more focused on his career outside of football, so a move to LA would probably be the best for him in the future. It's not necessarily a bad thing for the Steelers or for JuJu, it's just the Steelers are loaded at wide receiver and they need help at other positions, especially if Ben's going to take a pay cut. He's not going to be taking a pay cut just so he could have an additional wide receiver get paid. Up next, we have Desmond King, who is probably the best slot corner available in free agency, a player that was severely underrated throughout his career thus far, who dominated with the LA Chargers in the beginning of his career, that ended up on the Tennessee Titans this past season because the LA Chargers figured that they would not be able to retain his services. Any team that is in a need for a nickel corner would be lucky to have Desmond King. The problem is, I'm not exactly sure what kind of salary he will command. And to finish off this list is a player that said that he only wants to play for 2 more seasons before hanging it up for good, and that's Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman has had one of the most interesting NFL careers I think I've ever seen. From being a core component of the LOB in the beginning of his career with the Seattle Seahawks, to transitioning to the enemy with the San Francisco 49ers and being a captain on another remarkable defense, to trying to transition into more of a general manager role, which I feel like he'd be perfect for because this is a guy that's negotiated his own contract throughout his career. I think at this stage of his career, Richard Sherman wants to sign with a team that would happily help him transition to that general manager role. He's already won a Super Bowl, he's been to 3 Super Bowls, I guess that'd be an added bonus, but I don't think that's the main thing Richard Sherman is looking for at this stage of his career. Let me know in the comment section down below, are there any other players that you feel like I missed out on when compiling this list? Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.